Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Seth Jones. I'm the president of the Defense and Security Department at CSIS, and I'm here today with David Shedd. David's got a new book out, which we're going to talk about. David is the former Deputy Director and Acting Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, along with a range of other superb jobs in the U.S. intelligence community. David, you got a new book out with Andrew Badger, also from DIA. Welcome to CSIS.
Thank you, Seth, and I'm delighted to be here with CSIS.
And let me just hold up the book. I know we've got it here, but as you can probably see, if you can focus in on it, I've got it marked up in a whole range of areas and footnoted, which means I was dealing with it, underlining it, making marginal comments. So that's a good sign.
Great.
Great to have you here. All right, let's start with the title of the book, The Great Heist, and I won't tell people what the subtitle is because that starts to give it away. But what is the Great Heist, and can you tell us a little about the urgency today about why this is so important and why now?
The Great Heist is in reference to China's epic campaign in a very structured way, principally most recently over a 10-year period with Made in China 2025, to steal America's secrets in the corporate, business, industrial sector, from affecting Main Street all the way to Wall Street and all the way to our defense infrastructure, to the tune of FBI's estimate of $600 billion a year. So think about that over a 10-year period in the size of this. The Great Heist then is really a reference to the greatest transfer of wealth in history. When you think about what they've taken, what they've applied, not only in sort of the front end of the innovation, but all the back end in research and development that they've been able to bypass in terms of the cost and efforts to do that, which we know that in industry is a significant part of what's done to do that. And so, but the other thing, Seth, that I really want to bring out to the audience is that this isn't only about the heist of our blueprints and plans and architectural designs for products. It's also about information. A motivation, and you may have been very well included in this, in 2015, in May of 2015, 22 million of our security files.
Oh, I was in there. I know
now,
exactly what you're talking about.
So along with our 22 million best friends, past and present at the time, sit in Beijing. 2 years later, you have the great heist of the data of one of the large financial credit bureaus in terms of that.
You're talking about Equifax.
Equifax in 2017.
I was in that one too.
So there you go.
Yeah.
And so this is a story of the marriage between the technology heist alongside the data, which is fortuitous in terms of our interests. Artificial intelligence has come along for what we're looking to do. The Chinese are applying that artificial intelligence to massive amounts of data, health records that they have from Anthem and other places that they've broken through. So the Great Heist is bigger than just the technology piece. It's also the data.
And it also is, I think, on the back end, how they're using it for competitive advantage, economic competitive advantage, military competitive advantage, technological competitive advantage. Before we get into some of the details on what the Great Heist includes, and I do want to spend a little bit of time on the Ministry of State Security and its bureaus, because I think there's a lot of valuable information on the sort of the way the Chinese think strategically, but also how they're structured operationally to do this. But I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about your background here. And the reason is because you've seen this for decades from a couple of different vantage points. So where have you seen this and looked at Chinese activity? And because I think that provides people with a bit more understanding of your actual perspective on this.
Sure. For me, my wake-up moment after really serving mostly in Latin America in terms of my intelligence career up into the early 1990s, and Mexico being the last place, where the North America Free Trade Agreement was negotiated in that. I return to the US and I start to find myself in positions to see that China is up to something that really was almost prophetically put out there by Deng Xiaoping in a seminal speech in mid-1984, in which he talked about this coexistence of capitalism, Chinese style, controlled capitalism, at the same time with a uniparty state, which is, of course, the Chinese Communist Party. And as I would go to China in the mid-1990s, I would see the piracy.
This is where were you at the time?
CIA.
You were at the CIA.
The CIA.
Okay.
And I was declared to the Chinese. They knew who I was.
Oh, I'm sure they did.
But they didn't know it even just surreptitiously. They knew who I was.
Yeah.
And I would see the knockoff products, the piracy out on the sidewalks, whether it was Beijing, Shanghai, wherever it might be. And I was saying, they're stealing low end. What's going to keep them from moving to high end?
By the way, even a couple of years later, any of us deployed overseas for the U.S. military, including special operations, we would go to local markets and the movies that they were selling were all Chinese pirated movies that they were selling on the street in Afghanistan or Iraq or places like that. Chinese pirated movie theaters, or the movie industry was not making any money off of it. So
right. They actually sat in theaters filming it to put it on Betamax, if those can remember what those were. And the video cassettes were literally out there, pennies on the dollar, by the way. And obviously the intellectual property stolen at a relatively low end, but still substantially costly. With then, I think, coming back to your question, this idea that by getting them into the World Trade Organization, which then occurs in December of 2001, the Clinton administration spends the 90s moving them along. Remember, just for timelines, you have April to June 1989 in terms of the Tiananmen Square. So this is about 10 years later. You have every effort to bring them in, and it was premised on two sort of pillars of expectations. One was that by getting into the WTO, China would play by the international rules of business and finance and in terms of trade. And they were given most favored nation status and all of that. All that did was actually give China access to markets in the West. The second half was, and there were arduous debates while I sat in the White House in the early 2000s while we have the global war on terror after 9/11. Remember, the context here is they will also democratize, because if you give people choices economically, they will want choice politically. Nothing could be further from the truth today in both areas, because they've leveraged, again, the Great Heist around the economic piece, around the whole spectrum of what you described. Then on the democracy, as we see Jimmy Lai just having been sentenced, or is soon to be sentenced, but certainly convicted just in the last couple of days, related to Hong Kong,
right,
but the long reach of Beijing into Hong Kong. You go, it's anything but democratizing. You also see the persecution against Christians and Uyghurs and all the rest. So it is not opened up whatsoever. In fact, the 80 million strong CCP, Chinese Communist Party, is as strong as ever.
Yeah. So I do want to get to kind of the strategic view of the Chinese today and operational, but I actually think it would be helpful to start at the tactical level. There's a really interesting case that you walked through on GE Aviation right now, and an MSS, Ministry of State Security, Chinese spy case. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Chinese were doing in this particular case and how the U.S. law enforcement tracked the case, and then what was found at the end? And what does this tell us about what the MSS has been up to?
So I like to describe this, along with my co-author Andrew Badger, as sort of the classic intelligence operation, in where an individual is identified as an insider threat, so to speak,
right,
getting the designs of advanced engines for aircraft in GE avionics. And so the idea here was he was going to transfer that. He's caught, and the FBI turns him. This is called a double agent operation.
Right.
And they get him to start identifying who back in China is sort of his handler in the sense of getting the information for the Ministry of State Security in order to advance the interests of the People's Liberation Army's Air Force in terms of these advanced aircraft engines. And so what happens is it lays it out in the book, you end up with sort of a network of individuals identified and a spy case that actually brings out the MSS officer to a meeting location, ultimately in Brussels, and he's caught.
Almost Amsterdam.
Almost Amsterdam, but the call is we'll get more cooperation out of Belgium than we might than the Dutch in this particular case. So I'm not critical of the Dutch. I'm just saying in this case the FBI made that judgment. This is a long, protracted case in which you see classical aspects of it. The treasure trove, though, was to then have him, he's got a bundle of money, he's got a bundle, this is being the case officer version of the MSS, behind him. He's got photos of all this in multiple phones, and so it was sort of a classical spy case, which is just illustrative of many tools in the MSS toolkit in terms of going after intelligence.
The way you tell it in the book, there is a serious effort that's uncovered to understand exactly what the MSS was up to, that I think at least in other cases where there was a general sense of what the MSS was up to, this provided a much more granular view of what the MSS was doing, how it was doing it, how they were recruiting. What did it tell U.S. intelligence and law enforcement from the case?
So it told us that economic espionage or industrial espionage was front and center in terms of their interests. These weren't cocktail parties with first, second, and third secretaries in embassies trying to work others, or defense attachés trying to recruit a defense attaché out of official installations. So it tells us that piece. Secondly, it tells us that there was a whole of society or program around this industrial espionage that used classical espionage communications and that sort of thing. And as you say, the special agent Hall, he built this over time so that you had a lens on the end-to-end of this espionage case, which for an old spy master like myself is just fascinating to have it laid out there. But what the rest of the chapters identify is they have many tools in their kit.
Yeah.
And so we go through this whole description, and I think it's good to come back to the Ministry of State Security and what it is, and Bureau 18 and the centric aspect of the United States in that bureau to go after our secrets.
So let's shift to the MSS. What is the MSS, and can you talk a little bit about its organizational structure, particularly the 18th Bureau and its focus on the United States?
The MSS, for the longest time, much like the agrarian-based economy of China, was, shall we call it, a third-rate service. Under Xi Jinping, who, in a process of coming to power, but through 2011, 2012, creates a favored son out of the MSS, even over the People's Liberation Army, although it has elements of science or public security, and we can talk about them. The MSS has become a premier service, front and center in terms of capabilities as good as any in the world today, doubling in size with an estimated 300,000. Just to give you an idea, the entire unclassified number used for the intelligence community is roughly 100,000, 90 to 100,000.
Full-time operatives.
18 agencies under the Director of
Does
National
that include
Intelligence.
analysts and
Operators
case officers?
And FBI and all the rest. The 18 organizations inside the intelligence community as we know it. So it's 3 times larger. But here's the dirty little secret that's laid out in the book. The MSS, and we'll talk Bureau 18, is CIA, FBI, so it's the domestic security piece. It's the National Security Agency. It's Cyber Command. It's national geospatial all in one with no rules. How's that for, say, it doesn't have, our Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and I'm not arguing that should be taken down for the protection of Americans and FISA, right. Yeah. But for those who don't know the FISA, they don't have a FISA process.
Right.
It's anything
they don't have to go through a court process to start spying on citizens.
Everything is fair game. So much so, and you may want to touch on this a little more, but I'll advance it. The Intelligence Act, Security Act of 2017, now requires that every Chinese citizen in China as well as abroad, along with every single business entity, so think ByteDance that owns TikTok or any one of these, must cooperate with the MSS when called upon.
I mean,
it's a duty.
This is you're talking about, among others, Article 7 of the National Intelligence Law of the PRC. So I'm just going to read it here, or at least part of it. All organizations.
Yes.
All organizations and citizens shall support, assist, and cooperate with national intelligence efforts in accordance with the law.
Yeah.
So,
and as the old saying or the old refrain goes, they have their ways to make that happen if there is resistance to doing it.
So how from your perspective, how's that different, for example, than the way your old organization at CIA or even DIA or the FBI deal with companies or individuals in the United States, including U.S. citizens?
Well, fundamentally, we work on a voluntary basis in the United States. If a company corporate America wants to cooperate with the FBI or wants to cooperate, short of a subpoena, but I mean, just as a general matter. So there is a clear divide or separation between state and industry from that standpoint. You can't make Lockheed Martin come and support what you're doing. Now, they may cooperate with knowledge about certain things and all that. I'm not saying they do or don't, but that's very different than being put under duress of Article 7. Notice the word may doesn't appear, will cooperate. And so it's a very directive form of doing it. Secondly, can you imagine that you'd go out to Ames, Iowa, in the middle of the country and say, everything you're doing on agriculture, you need to turn that over to the government. We need that for whatever Monsanto and seed development, which there's a chapter on seeds and modified seeds that the Chinese have stolen, addressing the Great Famine of 50, 60 years ago, that it actually encapsulates everything about their society in contrast to ours.
Yeah.
And no rules apply. Seth, that's the main thing. No rules apply.
So until we have some sort of solution, which we don't have yet with TikTok, how does that work specifically for TikTok with Chinese ownership still? Everything on your app and your phone, they have access to according to Chinese law.
So I'm torn between what's more important, the fact that they have a backdoor to all the information of 160 million US users and 1.6 billion global users of TikTok. Just imagine the data that's produced from that in order to really determine patterns of life. So, and then my tension is, what's worse, that then they actually have influence operations as to what moves to the top of the TikTok viewing.
Or doesn't move to the top.
As importantly, doesn't move to the top. And so ByteDance, the parent of TikTok, whether it's a 20% ownership, whatever the deal is, it remains rather opaque in terms of the administration being clear on what this deal is. If they have any access on the Chinese side to the algorithms, it's an agreement that is illustrative of giving them the keys of the kingdom to data and then the manipulation of that data. Not unlike DeepSeek. DeepSeek is a ChatGPT Chinese version of which they stole the large language models to do DeepSeek, ask Microsoft. And so they build this at a much cheaper rate. China operates on an 80-30 rule, according to Bill Evanina, who was the counterintelligence expert for the intelligence community for a number of years, FBI agent. That 80-30 rule goes like this. 80% of the quality of the West in terms of the reproduction of it in China at 30% of the cost. But here's the deal. That 80% is going to 85, 90, 95%. A Huawei phone today, or ZTE Huawei, is on par in 5G today and going to 6G soon, with a lot of research and development that they're doing on their own at Huawei to the iPhone and Tim Cook's Apple world. So it's getting better.
Which is manufactured in China.
But manufactured in China, by the way. And on that 30% cost, yeah, it might inch up to 35 or 40%. But when you get your used auto parts or replicas of auto parts, they're 35% on Amazon, made in China versus made by one of the major auto dealers in the United States.
So if I can just come back to the 18th Bureau, it's the primary bureau within the MSS devoted to espionage against the United States. That's the one you focus on predominantly in the book. Where do you sit that within the broader aspect of Chinese intelligence activity? They obviously have elements of the People's Liberation Army that have been highlighted, and individuals have been prosecuted in the United States for offensive cyber operations, for example, or the Ministry of Public Security, or the influence campaigns with the United Front Work Department. So as you look at the MSS and the 18th Bureau, how do you characterize the broader Chinese intelligence effort? And how important is MSS Bureau 18 in just the broader this broader network of Chinese intelligence?
Just starting with the end part of your question on how important the 18th Bureau is, think of this as no resource constraint and no operation off the table. So if you think of the various cyber attacks that are known as the typhoons, Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, these attacks that have been codenamed by the FBI
and you might just take 1 second before we get into that. It's a Volt Typhoon, so for those not quite familiar.
Yeah, no, so we're talking about embedding into our infrastructure, embedding into our telecommunication systems, in and out of government, by the way, in terms of their ability to run these cyber operations. The 18th Bureau is driving that.
MSS is embedded in U.S. cyber networks.
Absolutely, and what under Xi Jinping for his 13 years in power now, from 2012 to present day, has made the MSS the centerpiece for their espionage capabilities. It doesn't mean that the PLA doesn't have a signals capability that's tactical. I mean, that's like saying DIA doesn't have certain capabilities that support the warfighter very specifically, which I'm, of course, very familiar with, in contrast to CIA. But the favored son, coming back to that term, of the operational drive of the MSS writ large, and there's bureaus that are dedicated to Europe, Latin America, Asia more broadly, as well as Africa, is that the MSS is far and away first among equals, and really driving the operational both content and tempo on behalf of meeting the 10 objectives of Made in China 2025 that was launched in 2015, alongside of this, for the audience, of the soft power Belt and Road of investments in ports and mines and other sorts of things. They run in parallel track, but the thing that we want to leave every reader or listener of this book is that
watcher
of the book is that what this book does is make some sense out of what looks to be madness on the part of the Chinese.
Yeah.
There is a plan, and they're working it assiduously to bring forward. They now, according to the Australian Foreign Policy Institute, about 65, 68 of all advanced research out of 74, 75 categories are now led by the Chinese. So it's not that they've folded their hands and just have to wait to steal the next thing. They're additive, and they're investing in research and development in STEM way ahead of the United States.
Yeah, and that actually raises an interesting question, and you mentioned Huawei earlier. You argue, and I'm quoting from your book, that China's supposed economic miracle is nothing less than a mirage, one that has been built on not on ingenuity, but rather on grand larceny. I mean, there are people who would disagree with parts of that, particularly now. We had Jensen Huang, the head of NVIDIA, in recently, who said while he was here, and I'll quote, this is from December 3rd of 2025, he said, quote, "Huawei is one of the most formidable technology companies the world has ever seen. They deserve all of the respect that everybody ought to give them. We compete with this company. They're formidable. They're agile. They move incredibly fast. As you have noted, as I have written about elsewhere, they have been involved in a range of intellectual theft. There's the Cisco case, there's T-Mobile, there's a Department of Justice indictment. But some would argue pretty strongly that a range of these Chinese companies are also increasingly innovative themselves. So how do you balance what you're seeing with the Great Heist and what we're seeing potentially with some companies able to do on their own?
Well, it's so interesting. Out of the 10 categories of priorities that ranged from AI to EV, the electric vehicles and aerospace and all of that, on the Made in China 2025, 8 out of those 10 have exceeded the expectations in Xi's own words. So clearly they have advanced things, and telecommunications is part of that panoply of 10 areas. So Huawei is a first-class system in terms of telecommunications, advanced well over the years of the early days of where you'd never own a Huawei phone. But now they have flooded the markets in Latin America and Africa and elsewhere while advancing their own technology. So the question for Mr. Wang that I would have is, so why would you then want to sell H200 chips that are artificial intelligence enabling at the forefront and give them that, which they will reverse engineer, as we tell the story of Elon Musk and what they did with the $1 billion thumb drive
with Tesla.
With Tesla,
Yeah.
in the driverless car and batteries portion of it, or Tim Cook with Project Titan in 2017, where Apple was going to have a driverless car, all stolen from him. And the stories go on, and you think you'll be the exception in terms of the use of that technology that you would give them. So we don't take anything away from China advancing the technology that they have. And by the way, again, for the viewers of this, the listeners and the readers, they steal to supplement, complement. They didn't steal a hypersonics package. They stole the knowledge in wind tunneling right out of Los Alamos with 172 scientists, 15 of those being part of the 1,000 Talents program, which is a dedicated MSS program which they took down in 2019 and rebranded it because it was getting bad publicity, but they still do that.
Well, they arrested a Harvard professor for lying about his involvement.
Professor Liebert.
Yes.
Where is he today? He's in Shanghai.
Yes, you note that in your book.
Yes. And my co-author, as a Harvard grad, is very familiar with the story from that standpoint. But I say all this that we're not taking anything away from what China does organically. This is additive, and again, it's pilfered alongside of the data. So if you continue to get the data on health records or other aspects of the health industry or sector of the United States and of the West, that data will come eventually to come back to bite us, because the pharma industry, of which they invest a lot in themselves, is additive then to what they're able to do applying AI and eventually quantum.
So this brings us to the end, and briefly, what do we do about it? Before I get to your pillars, one question, of course, is there are a lot of U.S. companies and multinationals that do business in China. You've got FedEx that delivers packages. Disney runs theme parks. What's the message to companies that maybe not involved in sensitive chips? I mean, that's the NVIDIA example, but that are doing business in China. Should they continue to do business? Should they be more alert to activities? What's your message to companies?
So I won't get on a moral high horse because of how the suppression of rights to Christians and the efforts in terms of the close down on Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong and that. But I will say that if it's not a part of the crown jewels that we must protect, and you're okay with doing business knowing they will take whatever IP you develop from it. Now that's harder to identify with Disney World, I get that. Do business with them. We don't make an argument in the 7 pillars because it's a good segue to that. But if you know, and again, leaving aside the persecution of Uyghurs and all of that.
By the way, the first of your 7 pillars is to protect the crown jewels.
Exactly.
So is that one of your big comments here? If you're not dealing with the crown jewels.
So Seth, it's 2 ends, and I think of them as a sort of bookends. Protect the crown jewels. The other end is establish a national economic security council, much like in 1947 the NSC was created, that we've been a part of, in terms of identifying the whole of government and private sector of what you're going to protect and how. And really, really put ourselves in a place where we identify what that is. Then you increase, through congressional support, legal barriers that exist to prosecuting the kind of economic theft that we have. They're all very old-fashioned in terms of going after that, making it a priority throughout that, increasing the cyber defenses and all the sorts of things. And one for the corporate world in the 7 pillars. I sit on a number of boards, public and non-public, and I will tell you that it's hard to get security into the C-suite. Mm-hmm. Well, it's not the CFO because that's the Q-on-Q, quarter-on-quarter earnings. It's not your
shareholders.
Yeah, and your shareholders
want to make money.
Right, make money. And for that quarter, you may well make money. The question becomes is, do you want to up your game on security so that you actually have longevity to your business, given that every Fortune 500 has had some kind of attack done on them and more will persist? And there is no letting up by the Chinese on this.
Well, David, I think we may have to leave it there. This has been a fascinating discussion. I will also note that at the end of the book, you end with the 7 pillars, everything from protecting the crown jewels to hardening corporate front lines, which you just noted. But the 2 chapters that precede that are sort of interesting future fictional examples, although of nonfiction issues. One takes place in the Situation Room with a future president and the decision-making process of how to develop a national strategy. And the other is in essentially the corporate world, a corporate boardroom, having to think about the implications of these. So you do a good job, I think, of sort of laying out some recommendations and solutions, but also putting us into the future a little bit and thinking about an environment where we've got to make some strategic level decisions, both in the corporate boardroom, but also in the national security space. So thank you for doing it.
Yeah, and in those 2 chapters, I want to do a shout out to Mike Gallagher and Matt Pottinger and others who helped shape those kind of things so that they weren't dry reading around some congressional report. I'm sorry to say it that way, but very practical in the sense that they're both a little fun to write as I wrote them.
Yeah, there's dialogue in there.
Yeah, we create a couple of, they're all fictional individuals in it, but not their titles, but the people in it, and just had sort of fun doing it while still communicating the sorts of things that end up with the 7 pillars.
I was hoping maybe you would have had the deputy DIA director or acting DIA director, but instead you had someone else.
Oh, no. I left that up to the DNI, and then he'd had the heart attack or whatever, he's in the hospital, and so he ends up being the deputy that has to go brief it. So it's just a little bit of fun in telling the story on a very serious and very urgent issue that we as America and the West more generally, and interesting, the Wall Street Journal yesterday, just to finish with this, is now headed for a divorce with China. Great article on how they see so much being stolen from Germany in terms of their manufacturing capabilities that Germany is having second thoughts about it. So there are some movements out there that are saying we need to change things.
Well, David, thank you so much for writing this, and thank you so much for coming here to talk about it. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk about the Great Heist.
Thank you, Seth, and thank you to CSIS as well. Appreciate it.
Thank you.